Hi everyone. Today we'll be talking about where babies come from in an anatomical sense, of course. Today I'll be using some renditions to discuss the anatomical features of the uterus, one of the most important organs in human reproduction, and how the uterus's unique structure allows it to perform the very special function of housing a growing fetus. We will also be talking about various uterine conditions, so let's go ahead and get started. This is a uterus, Latin for womb or belly. The uterus is a hollow, hormone responsive sex organ inside the female reproductive system of humans and most other mammals. One of the most remarkable functions of the uterus is its ability to house and nourish a fetus until it's ready for birth. This structure is arguably one of the most important in the body because it allows for continuation of the species. And this is true not just for our species, but across a variety of species. Depending on the type of animal or species of animal, the uterus can look very different. So this is an illustration of a simplex uterus, which is the type of uterus typically found in higher primates, such as humans and chimpanzees. Using this as a reference, you can kind of assess the shape and size of the uterus, which is about the size and shape of an upside-down pear. In humans, the uterus is found in the middle of the pelvic cavity in frontal plane. So right here. This can be envisioned as right between the hip bones and directly under the navel or the belly button. The uterus is held in place, somewhat suspended by ligaments called the endopelvic fascia. So the endopelvic fascia. And these ligaments include the pubocervical ligaments, the transverse cervical ligaments, the uterosacral ligaments, and the broad ligaments. Internally, it's positioned between the bladder and the sigmoid colon. So we can go ahead and get a side view of the uterus. So here we have a close-up view of the uterus so we can get a little bit more in depth about its different parts. So the uterus has four main parts: the fundus, the corpus, the isthmus, and the cervix. So up here we have the fundus. The fundus. And then here we have the corpus, or the body. The body of the uterus. The body is the large central part of the uterus where the fetus is housed during pregnancy. And then here we have the isthmus. The isthmus, which is the connecting structure between the corpus and the cervix. And then this structure here is the cervix. The cervix, which is the cylinder-shaped tube of tissue that connects the uterus to the vagina. And cervix is also Latin for neck. And then on either side of the uterus are structures referred to as the uterine horns, which connect the uterus to the fallopian tubes. So here and here we have our uterine horns. And then we have the fallopian tubes on either side, which then lead to the ovaries, one on either side of the uterus. And the ovaries are the structures that produce eggs for reproduction. So here we have our ovaries. The uterine wall, which is a structure comprised of 3 layers. And I've done an illustration of kind of a small chunk of the uterine wall so you can see the different layers. And we'll start with the outermost layer called the perimetrium. So right here, the perimetrium. I'll go ahead and put a P here for perimetrium. So the perimetrium is part of the visceral peritoneum that lines the viscera of the pelvis. And the perimetrium actually folds over itself to form the broad ligament on either side of the uterus. So remember earlier we talked about the broad ligament and how that helps kind of suspend the uterus in place in the pelvic cavity. And the uterus is completely covered by the perimetrium except for the cervix. So here, this chunk in here, this is the second layer. And this layer is called the myometrium, which is the second and thickest layer of the uterine wall and made up mostly of smooth muscle. And then finally, we have the third and innermost layer here. And this is a very important layer of their uterine wall called the endometrium. So I'll do an E here for endometrium. And this layer is made up of glandular cells. And the endometrium is composed of a basal layer, which is attached to the myometrium, and a functional layer, which sheds during menstruation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The uterine wall is important because this is the structure that allows for pregnancy and ensures the safe development of a growing fetus. So let's start with the endometrium. During a woman's menstrual cycle, various levels of the hormone progesterone and estrogen are released. Estrogen will thicken the endometrial lining of the uterus, and in the absence of progesterone, the functional layer of the endometrial lining will shed at the end of the menstrual cycle and will dispel from the body through the vagina. So if we go back to our frontal plane of the uterus, this lining in here, this is the endometrial lining in the uterus. So this will get very thick throughout the menstrual cycle. And then at the end of the menstrual cycle, in the absence of progesterone, it will shed out through the cervix and out through the vagina. And that is a woman's menstrual cycle. That is how a woman gets her period once a month, or why a woman gets her period once a month. Her body is getting rid of the blood and the tissue from the endometrium that will not be used to house a fetus. However, in the presence of progesterone, the simple epithelial columnar cells, so if we go back to the uterine wall, so we can see that these cells here are shaped like little columns. So the epithelial columnar cells of the endometrium begin to secrete nutrients that prepare the uterus to become a perfect environment for a growing fetus. For pregnancy to occur, a fertilized egg then attaches to the endometrium, and the endometrium then becomes the placenta that houses, nourishes, and protects the growing fetus. So let's move on to the myometrium, the middle and thickest layer of the uterine wall. So this M layer here. The myometrium is made of smooth muscle, which allows the uterus to expand from the size of a small pear to the size of a watermelon by the end of pregnancy. This layer also aids in contractions during labor, which help push out the baby and the placental contents. And then finally, we have the perimetrium, the outermost layer of the uterus, which is functionally similar to, any serous membrane in that it provides strength and support to the uterus, and it also helps connect the uterus to any other structures in the pelvis. So let's go ahead and talk about some clinical issues associated with the uterus, now that we have a good understanding of the structures and function of the uterus. The first is endometriosis. So endometriosis is a condition where the endometrium grows outside of the uterus on other organs of the body. Sometimes endometrium tissue can be found outside of the body, outside of the pelvis, like in areas like in the abdomen, or even it can be found in areas like the thumb or the knee. There are many theories as to why this happens. Some doctors believe that when a woman has her period, some of the blood and tissue from the uterus can travel out of the uterus through the fallopian tubes and into the abdominal cavity. Other times, endometriosis can spread at the time of surgery, for example, during a cesarean section, because endometrial cells are programmed to bleed in the absence of progesterone during a menstrual cycle. They bleed even if they are outside of the uterus. And when the blood touches other organs or tissue, this can cause inflammation, irritation, and intense pain. Endometriosis can also cause issues with the fallopian tubes and thus infertility. And secondly, we'll go ahead and talk about uterine prolapse. So uterine prolapse happens when the pelvic floor muscles and ligaments that keep the uterus in place stretch and weaken. And as a result, they can no longer provide support for the uterus, and the uterus begins to slip out of the vagina. So again, if we go back to our frontal plane view, the uterus begins to, these ligaments that hold the uterus in place here in the pelvic cavity, they begin to weaken, and then the uterus begins to slip. This affects women of any age, but is most common in postmenopausal women who have had one or more vaginal deliveries. And sometimes surgery is needed to repair the muscles or to remove the uterus completely, which is called a hysterectomy. Well, that's it for this video. Hopefully you have a little bit richer of an anatomical understanding and appreciation of the uterus and its function, because it is a fascinating organ. And thanks for watching.